I don't know if you have wrestled with the question on the screen or not, but I have. You know, all of us want local congregations that are embassies of the kingdom of God. Everyone here, I think, has that desire. And yet we've wrestled with this, and I've heard discussions since we've been here about this very question in different ways, like, is it actually possible over a long period of time to maintain vibrancy in a church? And it seems like sometimes we can come up over time with groups that are committed to each other and yet lose their vibrancy or even interest in their neighbors. Or we can come up with groups that have a lot of interest in their neighbors, a lot of outreach, but not much commitment to each other. And I want to begin by throwing up on the screen just some continuums for you to think about as we get our mind around what God might have in mind in our churches. What is the purpose of church? So here's a horizontal continuum here. On one side, we have what I'm calling a family church. It's a group of believers you worship with. It's a place where the biological family unit is preeminent, and the goal of the church is to bless the family. It's the best option right now for our family. It's a place you go to worship. They've got what we need for our youth right now. We like it. But if things change, we could move on if we need to. On the other end of this continuum is what I call a church family. It's a community of believers to which you are committed and accountable. The group is preeminent, and the goal of the family is to bless the church. Now, I want to say right off that don't get caught up in the two ends. I don't think anyone here is at completely either end. Think of this as a continuum for a little bit. But think about your own church community right now, your own perception of what God might have in mind. Where do you think He would put a church on this continuum? But you know, strength of community is not the only thing involved here. I want to overlay this with a vertical continuum, and I'm going to call it the top evangelistic and the bottom non-evangelistic. Now, you can make it vibrancy if you want, but I'm thinking about a church that has spiritual vibrancy within it and is caring in that local community. This is not just sending money off overseas somewhere, but actually interacting in the local community and caring about them. Just think of it as spiritual vibrancy. Now, out of these two, I want to just, and this is way too simple, but just think for a little bit about each of these quadrants as being a church model. I'll start with number 4. This is a church, we could say it's more of a social club maybe. Little commitment to each other or accountability, little interest in others. We could call it an anemic church. Not a lot of power there. Number 3 is a church that's strong on community, but weak on outreach. You know, if someone's barn burns down in this church, everybody's there to take care of them. They know how to take care of each other. They love each other. They care about each other. They see themselves here as totally committed for life. They're not going anywhere. They're committed to each other. We call this sometimes a strong or a thick culture. But there's a problem here. There's little interest in reaching out to their neighbors. Not very concerned about them. Model 2, weak on community, strong on outreach. This is a church that you could say likes to talk about outreach. It's an emphasis here. They might have a street ministry, a mission board, probably have 1 or 2 mission boards in this church. Kids club, soup kitchen, a lot of activity going on, but not a lot of commitment to each other. Not a lot of accountability. In fact, I attend and go to churches like this sometimes, and I'll ask people, how long have you been in this church? And it might be 3 to 5 years. For some reason, they moved from somewhere else, but they're all about outreach. Things don't work out, we can always move on. And then finally, number 1, and I want to propose, this is what Jesus actually had in mind, is a church that both has a strong commitment to each other and also a strong desire to reach out to others. Now, the question we're asking today is this even possible? And I want to propose it is, and we'll come back to this in the end. But I'm convinced it's more difficult in our time, in our culture, in our setting, than it maybe has ever been before. Why is it difficult to maintain vibrancy over time? Why is that? I want to look at 4 areas today. I want to start with the historic challenge or cycle. It's not a new problem we're dealing with. 2, Strong culture and multi-generational faith. I want to look at the importance of stable church life or culture, especially during times of ease and affluence. 3, a vibrant faith that is worth preserving. You know, a strong culture preserves everything, good and bad. So what is this thing we're trying to actually preserve? It's essential that we examine more than just culture here. And finally, threats and opportunities. I want to look around us today at our own culture we're swimming in, the water we're swimming in, also where we may be going. Now, I'll just say this once here as a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on this topic. I'm a fellow struggler in a local congregation just like all of you. So today as I talk, receive this from a fellow struggler. Number 1, I want to look back a little bit in church history at a cycle that's happened and some patterns. I want to go clear back to the early church for just a little. There's a gradual change you'll see in the book of Acts as Luke describes what happens here. And I'll say it's a gradual shift in tone, not a shift in theology, but a shift in tone. I'm going to go back and start with the first followers of Jesus. We could just describe them as radical discipleship. It's a love-obedience relationship with Jesus and his followers, a reliance on prayer and fasting and the Holy Spirit for guidance. There was this abandonment of self for the good of the church community. And there was actively reaching out to the poor, the hurting, and the lost. Acts 2 and 4, especially the ends of those chapters, are just exciting to read. I just love going there and reading that material. It was focusing on Jesus. It was doing the things that he had been doing when he was here. They were just like little Jesuses out there in community, actually reaching out and blessing. There was caring for the poor. It was preaching the gospel. It was sharing goods. It was pouring out of their own lives for the good of others. But I want you to notice there's something missing in Acts 2 and 4. There's no mention of rules, nothing about structure, nothing about hierarchy, and none of this stuff. Just an outpouring of blessing toward others. No fussing around about detail. Just being Jesus to everyone they met. And the only threat they had, the only pressure they had, the only problem they had was external. But as we know, it didn't go on very long like that. We get to organization and structure, and before long, roles are being defined, the decisions made, and there was these logical responses to needs, and deacons were ordained, and elders ordained in every city. In Acts 15, a decision model, and prescribed patterns of life established and taught. Very shortly after the church is formed, in fact, the 6th chapter, you start to hear these problems. Now they're internal problems. Now there's this thing about the widows complaining here, and the need for deacons, and a little structure here. We see the epistles going out, these letters going out of practical advice, of messages to husbands and wives and employers and employees, and just how do you live this thing out? A way of living is being developed. And the church begins to apply biblical principle. As time goes by, something else happens. A culture develops. Acts 9 is the first time we read about the way or the path. It was becoming something prescribed here that was happening repeatedly. And the church becomes this fortress against heresy. It's something different than you read in Acts 2 and 4. Now there's a battle going on here internally and externally, and a culture is developing. Things are more settled. Things are more routine. It becomes more normal and defined. And then Jesus breaks in the book of Revelation to the church at Ephesus and says this: you have left your first love. A lot of good things going here, a lot of culture, a great pattern of life, but something is missing in all this. That initial life, that initial vitality, that vibrancy, and that love for Jesus is missing. And Paul, with a similar message in Corinth, says this: to return back to the simplicity that is in Christ. In other words, get back to where you started again. Get back to that initial love for him. That initial love, obedience for Jesus and his followers that you had in the early church. Go back. Go back to God. There was a time you were dependent on God and self was totally surrendered. Get back to that again. Now, there's a similar pattern in church history. And I'm going to focus just a little on Anabaptist history. And I want to just say this about Anabaptists. Some of you here were not raised in Anabaptist tradition, and that's okay. That word doesn't mean a lot, actually. All it is a name that was given to a group of people because they wanted to serve the Lord and love Jesus in their time. If you were going to start a group today, infant baptism is not the big issue of our. You might call a group maybe non-materialists or non-resistance, or I don't know what you would call them today. But I want you to get the picture of what it is. All we're talking about is a group of people who simply want to love and follow Jesus in daily life. There's nothing special about the name. But let's walk back a little cycle through what's happened in Anabaptist history. Very, very similar to the early church. It begins this radical discipleship, stunning similarities to the early church. Rejection of the state, infant baptism, wealth, return to the Bible, little structure. It was just people on the run wanting to serve Jesus. Conrad Grebel describes his desire to be biblical like this. I believe the Word of God without a complicated interpretation, and out of this belief I speak. Very simple theology, just simply take what Jesus said, what the Bible says, and live it out. Little structure, but as we all know, structure was coming. It wasn't long. In fact, it was just 2 years till the Schleitheim Confession. Start sitting down and say, okay, now how's all this supposed to work? We're getting kind of scattered here. We need a little organization. Let's come together and decide what's it mean to follow Jesus. Which groups do we even accept? What does a church member look like? Who do we accept within the body of Christ? What beliefs are worth separating over? Who is a true believer? Who is that? And it's not long then, time goes by, and a strong culture develops. Culture tends to thicken over time, and that can be a good thing, for good or bad. And then throughout history, someone wakes up and says this, wait, we've left our first love. Something's missing. We're going through all the motions here. We've got all the right words. We've got all the right stuff going on, but we're just simply going through the motions. I remember a phone call several years ago from an individual. He was living in a I would call it a very thick culture. And he called and said this. He said, we've left in our church services. He said, I think the name Jesus is only mentioned twice, and that's when we're praying. We've got a lot of good stories, a lot of good illustrations, a lot of good stuff, but something is missing. And this has happened repeatedly throughout history where we get this thick culture and someone says, hey, something's missing here. We're missing something. And they begin to talk to someone else, and out of that usually springs what we call spiritual revival or renewal groups. There's more interest in prayer and coming together and fasting and return to what does the Bible say. You know, there's something very interesting in renewal groups. In fact, in some ways, they remind me of the children of Israel as they left Egypt. It says this about the group that left Egypt, and a mixed multitude went up also with them. And scholars assume this was probably the offspring of marriages between maybe the Israelites and Egyptians, or it could have been Egyptians from a lower social strata where they just wanted to get out of hard labor. We don't know, but we do know this, that not everyone that left Egypt was leaving just because of a sincere love for God. There was a mixed multitude. You know, that happens in renewal groups as well. Almost every time you start a renewal group, you have people coming along with them that really are just tired of being told what to do. They're just a little weary of that. And this sounds pretty good, and yeah, we'll go and do more prayer and whatever, but it's not long they find out that actually when they get where they're going, there's some rules there too, and that's kind of a challenge. But almost always, there are those who are actually, the burning desire in their heart is a love relationship with Jesus. They really want Jesus. And so out of this comes those who get back again to radical discipleship. Revivals almost always result in some being able to get back again to radical discipleship, but not everyone. There's usually some that simply assimilate into the world. Remember, radical discipleship still requires submission to others. It still requires that. And we eventually get what we love. When you start to shake a culture, when you start to change a culture, when do you stop shaking that culture? When do you end that? I remember a phone call I had several years ago from an Amishman. And he told me this. He said he was in a very thick culture. He said, I don't even want to be Amish. He said, I don't even like horses. He said, I just don't want to be Amish. But he said, here's my problem. As I look out and look at people in my community, he lived in a very dense population of Anabaptists. I can't see one single family that has left the Amish church that I'm happy with their children and grandchildren. That's the problem. So he said, I'm still Amish. But in spite of this, in renewal groups, the stated goal is always a love, obedience to Jesus and his people. And that should be our ultimate goal. That is the goal we're after, all of us here today. Now, there's two primary ways that this tends to be passed on to others, both to children and to seekers. One of those is through a costly exhibit of faith in time of persecution. And you'll see this in the early church. You'll see it in the Anabaptists. They weren't coming from some strong, united culture. They didn't have that. What they had was a demonstration of persecution of people who were willing to lay down their lives, even in the middle of flames, because they believed in something greater than this present world. It was a demonstration of who Jesus was. That still happens today in persecuted countries today. That's still going on today. There's another way that this faith many times is perpetuated or promulgated, and it's through strong counterculture in times of prosperity. There's a thickening of culture that actually, and we'll get into a little more detail of this, is stabilizing for young people as time goes on in prosperity. You know, this strong counterculture can be pretty stabilizing and very essential in lives of children and young people looking on. If you're always jumping and moving around, it's not very stabilizing for young children. So our challenge today, though, is how do we maintain vibrancy? And the problem is that renewal groups, many of us are in renewal groups, almost always neglect culture and history. They almost always. And there's a reason for that. They're coming from what they believe was too much culture. An emphasis on issues that maybe had no even biblical basis or have lost that biblical basis. And they want to return to what does the Bible say? And they believe that good teaching can overcome a lack of cultural stability. Now I want to just give one more observation that I've made in the Anabaptist church. Almost always, in fact, there is a constant flow from Model 3 to Model 2. There's a frustration with accountability, and there is a movement from close community to a more spiritual church and a desire for biblical teaching. You know, if you're familiar with Holmes County, Lancaster County, you know that there's a constant flow from the Amish to Beachy. If you are used to the Old Order Mennonite or even Weaverland, there's a constant flow from Weaverland to Mid-Atlantic. You're familiar with that if you're familiar with those areas. There's a constant flow that direction. But there's something else that happens. In the next generation, there's usually a move to Model 4. In fact, many times the children then, all they've heard all their life is the problem with culture and rules. They want to get as far away from that as they can. They simply go on from where their parents went. But I said earlier that culture is actually, in times of prosperity, in times of freedom, is important. Why are strong cultures important? What is the important? Why does that even matter? Let's look a little at strong culture and multi-generational faith. I want to look at why culture is important, especially in times of prosperity. I want to look at 4 reasons, and then I want to give one disclaimer to this. First, humans are more than brains on a stick. Our Western culture likes to teach us that we are all just primarily, fundamentally thinking machines. You are what you think is a common theme. And we like to think that what we're doing all the time is simply because we've thought through what we're doing. That's not actually true. Thinking is very important, but you know there's something else we are besides thinkers. We're actually lovers. We have deep loves within. Loves many times, not just intellect, drive our actions. They drive our choices. And this is why Jesus targeted our loves. I want you to notice these words. He that loves father or mother more than me. He that loves son or daughter more. He that loves his life shall lose it. That which is highly esteemed among men, or love for the world. Jesus focused on our lives. And just to make sure we got the message, he added one more. He sort of forsaketh not all that he hath. In other words, Jesus is calling for a total transformation, not just of our thoughts, but of our loves. He actually wants to change us inside. So why is culture important? Because culture develops longings and loves. And this is sometimes hard to articulate, yet it's very real. The things we do repetitively, the things we do impact our daily routines, impact our loves. They develop our strong preferences. If you ever noticed this before, but you find someone who was raised on a dairy farm, someone who got up at 4:30 every morning all the time they were young and milked cows. Almost always you'll find someone who may not be a dairy farmer now, but they still look back on those days with nostalgia. There's something that pulls them to a cow, simply because of that repetitive action. You find someone who was raised in a liturgical church, and then try to get them to enjoy some worship team somewhere. Very difficult for them, because the things we do repetitively over and over and over again produce habits and tend to create inner loves. The story we live, our life, is very powerful in developing those loves. In his book, Hidden Worldviews by Stephen Wilkins, he asks this question: why do we buy what we buy, eat what we eat, and say what we say? Why do we have the friends we have? Why do we work and play as we do? And he says it's largely because of the story we've lived. Not because we've thought through all those things, but because of something that's happened within us. How do we receive this story in church life? It's primarily through songs, the songs we sing, the text, what we read, and the collective practices that embed a worldview. Now, if your church culture that you came from, if that was a beautiful expression to you, if it was beautiful in your life, that's powerful in your life. If it's ugly, it's not. And that's why church splits are so damaging to young people. It destroys that within them. They thought they had something beautiful here, and it fell apart. Church splits in youth can be devastating. Culture provides a seedbed where life can flourish. That's true in a healthy home. That's true in a healthy church. It's a strong deterrent to the cultural winds and influence that are blowing in our age. It's an excellent place for faith to grow. But everything I just said needs to go with a disclaimer. The disclaimer is this: that the Holy Spirit, not culture, is what provides life and vitality. In other words, soil, the best soil in the world, without seed is worthless. Nothing will grow there. And God must provide that life, must sustain that sustaining life. Culture alone is a dead thing. As in the natural, so in the spiritual. Life still comes from God. And further, we don't read anywhere that in the end we'll stand before God and be judged by our culture. That's not what it says. It's going to be judged by our love, obedience, relationship to Jesus. You go back to Matthew 25. It's about how did you relate to the poor and hungry? How were you living out your life? You know, culture, think of it like wealth. You can say that we shouldn't trust in culture, and you can say we shouldn't trust in wealth, and both are true. Yet the fact is, if you get a pile of wealth high enough, it's pretty hard not to trust in it. And the same is true in culture. You get a strong enough, a thick enough culture, it's very difficult not to trust in that culture. So I want to say that the culture is important in passing on faith, both in the home and in the church. In fact, you could say it's almost essential to pass on faith. But the Anabaptist challenge is this: how do we develop cultures, even strong cultures, that encourage vibrancy and an outer focus? How do we do that? I think one of the ways we do that is by stopping once in a while and looking at what we are attempting to preserve. Now, I want to think about that just a little. A vibrant faith that is worth preserving. Now, none of us today would say, I'm confident, that everything the Anabaptists do is worth preserving. Everything they do is just worth keeping. So let's go back a little and look at what were the values, what were the beliefs that the early Anabaptists had that are worth preserving, that we should be preserving today. And your list might look different than mine, but I want to look at some early Anabaptist values that I believe are still very relevant today. Number one, their focus was on Jesus. It was a follow me theology. It wasn't complicated. They just simply wanted to be like Jesus. They simply wanted to obey him. Here, a while back, I read a biography about the Wright brothers, and it talked about the village there at Kitty Hawk. They would watch these two strange guys go out there by the ocean and stand on a sand dune and watch birds, and then they started imitating them. They said they would stand out there and hold their hands out and try to mimic what the birds were doing. They were trying to get a handle on this thing of how do these birds fly? See, they knew the birds knew something and could do something they couldn't do. So it was important for them to actually imitate what the birds were doing. That same principle applies in our lives today as we want to imitate Jesus, actually examine his life. How does that apply to our life today? What would Jesus do in this situation today? Number two, the early Anabaptists collectively demonstrated two kingdom values and priorities. They didn't just do it alone. They believed in church. They wanted a collective exhibit. They wanted this church to be an embassy of the kingdom of God right here. They wanted that. What did Jesus say about wealth? What did he say about accumulation of property? What did Jesus say about the responding to your enemies? They wanted to go back and find out what he said about that. Number three, they emphasized brotherhood, surrender, sharing of goods. Amazing, like the early church, they had a real desire to share, a real desire to give to each other, even in financial things, to care about each other. They believed it wasn't theirs anyway, and so they wanted to share it with each other. I grew up in the Brethren tradition, and I remember stories of Alexander Mack. We called him the founder of our particular constituency. And I remember hearing stories of him when it came time to leave Germany and come to America. He was a wealthy man, of selling what he had to get all the church over here. Those are stories that we hear of people who didn't view their own goods, their own money, as their own. And that is still a value today that is worth preserving, and it's a tremendous witness to the world. Number four, godly families, commitment, teaching and nurturing. Menno Simon wrote a tremendous amount about raising a family, just how to raise a family. Today, in a world where commitments mean so little, the Anabaptists are still a great example here. Tremendous amount of work to be done here, but they're still an example of this in our world. They're worth keeping. Number five, actively reached out to the poor and lost, even at risk of life. Both the early church and the Anabaptists were simply known for this. Remember Paul getting ready to go out and preach the gospel on a missionary journey. The instruction they left him with was, don't forget the poor. Even as you're out there preaching the gospel, don't forget about the poor. Menno Simon's true evangelical faith cannot lie dormant. It's a statement that has represented both the early church and the Anabaptists, and it's worth preserving, especially in a materialistic America. And six, they gladly surrendered their lives rather than compromise. I want you to picture for a little bit a man at the stake, maybe an old man at the stake, and around this flame going up are all these children and grandchildren and uncles and aunts who are observing Grandpa, who's willing to die instead of recant his beliefs. What kind of an impression would that leave on you as a child? How does that apply to today? You know, I think in times of prosperity, we need more Anabaptist businessmen who are willing to demonstrate by their lives and their choice of resources that they see something greater than this current materialistic society. In fact, some of them may be willing to walk away from that simply to share the gospel somewhere else. That also, like Grandpa at the stake, has an impact on children observing. It's choosing to use your older years, maybe in a refugee camp, maybe just pouring out your life in your local congregation, maybe just taking care of elderly, but using it to bless those around you. It's a public demonstration just like Grandpa at the stake. It's surrendered lives, and surrendered lives have always been powerful to those looking on. Threats and opportunities. You know, many of us been involved in business have been used to SWOT analysis, where you take your business and you look at strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And it's called a SWOT analysis. And it's done with both internal and external threats and opportunities. Today I want to do a similar thing with where I see the Anabaptists today. I want to start with weaknesses and threats. One of those threats is prosperity. Being enthralled with I'll call it the Anabaptist good life. You know, persecution tends to strengthen churches, and prosperity tends to weaken them. And it's possible, in fact, it's very possible, to look very plain on the outside and live very worldly, self-centered lives. To obey a few baseline rules to be part of my church, and that's all okay, but actually have a selfish heart within that's doing what I want to do. That's very, very possible. And it's one of the reasons why Jesus warned against wealth, against affluence. You know, one of the enemies of the Anabaptists wrote this one time about the Anabaptists. He said, they are somewhat indifferent to earthly things. Would your neighbors say that about you? That he's somewhat indifferent to earthly things. That's not where his focus is. Number 2, individualism. Difficulty submitting to authority or brotherhood. You know, if I have enough resources, I don't need you really. I don't need to listen to you. I can kind of do what I want to do. Some of you may have read some of Carl Trueman's books. Carl Trueman is a Reformed professor. He wrote a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Very, very good book. But he describes the cultural water we're swimming in right now. And I want to just read a quote. He says this: "The expressive individual is the sovereign individual. All other relationships," notice by sovereign, who's king? "All other relationships to other people, to institutions, to those who hold office in such institutions, is subordinate to the personal needs and feelings of me as an individual. Thus, I can choose whether to acknowledge their authority. I can choose what my commitment to them should involve, and how I should treat any counsel they give me. I decide how I should respond to any attempt to rebuke or discipline me. Notice, I am the sovereign arbiter of what is good for me. Everybody else can practically give me nothing more than pious advice based upon their opinion." And I want to suggest today that this quote is not about somebody else out there. It's about all of us. It is the water culturally we are swimming in today. And it gives us this important platform as an individual. What I think is very important. You should listen to me. What I think is important. Number 3. Another threat or weakness is in enjoyable diversions, electronics, hobbies, sports, games. When we lose our vision for why we are here, why God has placed the church here as an embassy, when we lose that vision, we become distracted. Hobbies, games, sports, all kinds of things, electronic entertainment. I personally believe that movies may be one of the most deadly to us right now. They move our values in slow, imperceptible steps. And they do it by effectively pulling you into the narrative. Go back to this chart again, this diagram. A well-crafted movie or a video pulls you in, and you live vicariously with that guy on the screen or girl on the screen. We feel their emotions. We're drawn into that. And sin, after a while, doesn't always seem very bad. Their values become our values. And that happens slowly. We don't realize what's happening. But eventually, lying, adultery, murder, all that doesn't seem as evil as it once did. A good movie director can pull you in like that and help you participate. And I want to suggest that you can't do that over time. You can't watch a lot of Hollywood and not be moved in your deep values. Sports is another issue that's having a powerful impact on our communities. Someone has graphically shown the shift like this. This is some of the artwork that was probably the most famous artwork out there of Dirk Willems returning to save the sheriff. And we're familiar with the story. but it depicts really the Anabaptists in the early days. But today they've changed it to this, where some communities are actually becoming known more for sports. Someone has even coined the term salvation by fun. Just give your children enough volleyball, enough good times, and eventually they'll want to be part of us. I recently had a discussion with some Mennonite leaders, and they were decrying the lack of enrollment in their Bible schools. And they said you have to really watch where the volleyball tournaments are on the calendar, or you really lose the people. And I want to just suggest today, I'm not opposed to sports, but an overemphasis on sports can be a threat to us today. Number 4, information overload, globally versus locally connected. Technology brings so much information to us, more than we can handle. Do I really need to know what's happening all around the world all the time? And am I as well connected to my neighbors, to my wife, to my children, as to what just happened in Bangladesh and some flood that just happened there? Are we becoming distracted? 5, group versus Jesus-centric. We become our own point of reference. Recently, this happens with thick culture. It's a danger in thick culture. I was having a discussion with a couple, and I was telling them about some things that were just been happening, exciting, happening in restricted countries. And one of them stopped me and said this, do those new believers practice the ordinances like we do? In other words, we're kind of the reference now, and are they doing it like we're doing it? You know, we need to decide how to practice ordinances. We need to be able to explain it to our children. It's okay to defend that. But too much church culture, and we begin to judge others by how we are doing it. We never were the reference point. That's not who we are. 6, Christian nationalism, fear of losing wealth and lifestyle. There's a growing push in America to make this country a Christian nation. We like our capitalism. We like our affluent lifestyle. We like that. When we feel threatened, we forget that we're citizens of a different country. And these kinds of expressions actually confuse seekers, and they also confuse our children. Let's think a little about strengths and opportunities. How can we maximize the blessings that we have been given? I'll look at 6 areas here. We follow Jesus, and that means both separated from the world and engaged in our world. James says it like this, pure religion, undefiled before God and the Father is this. Notice, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, there's an outward focus, and to keep himself unspotted from the world, there's a defensive posture as well. Now, some churches are very, very good, it seems like, at focusing on reaching out and little emphasis on separation. And some are real good about separation, but not much word about reaching out. We can't afford to do that, though. You know, in our world right now, there are more fatherless and widows, roughly 123 million displaced people, than there have ever been by far. There's a tremendous need to be reaching out to others. We are to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We are to be both separate and engaged in our world, and we see this in the early Anabaptists. Brotherhood, relinquishing preferences out of love. Jesus said this, that by this shall all men know you're my disciples. By what? By our love for the lost? He didn't say that. He said by your love for each other, because you care about each other. Tremendous evangelistic tool when others can see a local church where they love each other, where they're willing to lay down their own personal preferences for each other. Church splits are extremely damaging to the mission of Jesus. Submitting to my brother, being willing to lay down my own preferences for him is actually part of evangelism. That's actually what that is. It's a statement that Jesus is here. 3, godly homes, Jesus' platform for ministry. The Anabaptists today are known in general, I'll say, for having godly families. But so often we forget what Jesus said about godly homes. You know, our homes are not just for us. And Jesus didn't give very many details, but he did on one issue. And that is how to make out a guest list when you have people over. When thou makest a dinner or a supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsmen, nor thy rich neighbors, lest they also bid thee again, and a recompense be made. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. In other words, when you have people into your home, don't call everybody just like you. Don't go out and try to find the demographic people, same skin color, just like you. Go out and find other people and bring them in. You know, I grew up in a home where it was not uncommon. I was the youngest child. Maybe that was partly the reason, I don't know. But we had a lot of atheists around our table. Tremendous opportunity to listen to your father talk to atheists. Tremendous. I learned a lot of apologetics around the dinner table from that. Now, I want to say, and we're aware of this, discretion needs to be used in this area. In our culture today, especially with small children. But I still believe that our children should sense in us a passion for our neighbors. They should hear us praying for our neighbors. They should see us being willing to have our neighbors and to be with our neighbors. A tremendous opportunity here. 4, parachurch organizations, another opportunity to interact and bless others. The local church, your local church, should be the most exciting thing in your life. It should be where your primary focus is. And yet there is an opportunity and a blessing in getting out like you are right here today and reaching out to others and connecting and learning from them. Here in Oregon, I appreciate the CAM getting together to pack food together. It's an opportunity to get together and learn from others. Within the larger Anabaptist family, there's tremendous opportunity to learn. I get phone calls because of my job partly, almost every day from someone from some other constituency. There's an opportunity to share and compare. It's a beautiful opportunity. Let's use that. 5, Muslims. Amazing opportunity to connect and relate. There's an incredible influx of Muslims into our country. It's almost like the Lord said, if you're not going to go there, I'll bring them here. And it's a huge opportunity. And the Anabaptists have a special niche, I'll say, in connecting with them. I don't know how many I've talked to who have just been amazed that you're a Christian and yet your wife dresses modestly. That's a huge open door with Muslim people. That's not what they expected when they came to this country. Don't expect quick conversions, but go ahead and put the gangplank down. When the Lord raises the water in their life, they have a place to go. They've got a bridge to go across. Develop a relationship with them. Historic precedent. Fasting from good, convenient options. I think personally we can learn a lot from monastic movements of the past. You know, when we fast, those of us who are here as believers, when we fast, we don't fast because food is bad. We fast because we don't want to be brought under the power of it. And you know, we've been taught, maybe a little bit of fundamentalist background that gets in sometimes, but we've been taught that we should divide between the good and the bad. If something is evil, we stay away from it. If it's good, we partake of it. But I want to suggest today we're entering a time that if we're going to survive, we're going to have to also say no to some good things just to keep from being drowned in good things. There is so much opportunity, so many things we can do. There may be time for us to do some fasting from good things that are actually good. There's nothing wrong, but they can overpower us. So how do we maintain vibrancy in multi-generational churches? I want to propose that all 3 of these elements are needed. You can think of them as a 3-legged stool if you want to. But if you're going to survive in affluent, prosperous America, I believe you're going to need all 3. I'm not saying all 3 are equal here. They're not equal in value, but I think they are all needed. We actually need that essential love, obedience with Jesus. Our relationship with Jesus is essential. You can't preserve faith if you don't have it. You can't pass it on to others if you don't have it. If we're going to be actively involved in His work, we're going to have that love, obedience relationship with Him. We also need some structure. There's a reason why those first apostles ordained leaders in every city. I want to say this to you young men. There's quite a few young men here today. I want to encourage you in studying history, especially church history. We need men today like the men of Issachar who have studied and know what Israel ought to do in this time and place. And finally, I want to encourage us toward a Jesus-focused counterculture. If we're going to survive prosperity, if we're going to survive, I would call easy believism theology even, we're going to need a Jesus-focused counterculture. And we do that by preserving it with the text, the songs and practices. Conclusion, no, I don't think we have to choose between the two. I don't believe that. I don't think you have to choose between vibrancy and multi-generational churches. I don't think Jesus will call us to a place he can't sustain us. I don't believe that. But I do believe this. I think we underestimate the challenge and the difficulty of the time we're living in. You know, sometimes we hug ourselves because we're not living in a persecuted country. And yet I see many times in persecuted countries the vibrancy that I long for in my own life. We are being pressured by a multiplicity of things. One of those, I'll list about 4 things in conclusion here. One of those is this self thing, this idea that I am very important and a difficulty in laying down my life for others. Another is just simply affluence, just simply the power of affluence in our lives. Another is technology. Technology tends to make me think constantly that I'm very important and I don't really need you. I can check whatever I want. I don't need Grandpa either. I can just get all the information I need whenever I want it, however I want it. And the other is possibly fundamentalism or the easy believism theology that we are swimming in. So I want to say that I believe that the strong cultural winds we're living in today are not a time for complacency. And I really believe that our youth, we have a growing number of youth today that are weary of smoke and mirrors. They really want authenticity. They want to see it in our lives. And if we have a faith today that's worth preserving, it's also worth promulgating and sharing with others. And if it's worth promulgating and sharing with others, it's also worth preserving. May God bless each of you as you return to your local congregations and do both.